So you survived the first century. Congratulations. You've witnessed the birth of an empire built on missing mathematics, toxic wine, and the stubborn refusal of a crucified carpenter's followers to simply disappear. You've seen cities turned to ash, temples torn down, and steam-powered theater that vanished into historical footnotes. Now pour yourself something else. Something stronger, maybe. Because if you thought the first century was chaotic, the second century Anno Domini was when Rome decided to lean fully into its own magnificent insanity. Welcome to the years 101 through 200 Anno Domini, the century when Rome reached its absolute peak and then spent the remaining decades staring into the abyss, wondering if maybe all that lead-sweetened wine had been a mistake after all. This was the century of the 5 good emperors. 5 rulers so competent, so successful, so beloved by history that their reigns became the gold standard for imperial leadership. It was also the century when a single emperor built a wall across an entire country just to keep out people he found annoying. But let's start with the good news, because there actually was quite a bit of it. In 101 Anno Domini, Marcus Ulpius Traianus became emperor. We know him as Trajan because Romans apparently believed in the power of shorter, more memorable names for their marketing materials. Trajan was not Roman. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would become Rome's most successful military commander, who would expand the empire to its greatest territorial extent, who would be remembered as one of history's finest rulers, was born in what is now Spain. He was the empire's first provincial emperor, and he was absolutely magnificent at the job. Trajan conquered Dacia, roughly modern-day Romania, in 2 separate campaigns that were so successful they funded decades of public works projects. He built forums, baths, libraries, and monuments. His forum in Rome was so spectacular that people traveled from across the empire just to walk through it and feel small in comparison to its marble splendor. But Trajan's masterpiece wasn't architectural, it was logistical. He conquered Mesopotamia and pushed Roman borders all the way to the Persian Gulf. For a brief, shining moment, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. It was the largest the empire would ever be, and it was glorious. It was also completely unsustainable, but Trajan probably didn't spend much time worrying about sustainability. He was too busy being legendary. When Trajan died in 117, Anno Domini, power passed to his adopted son Hadrian. And Hadrian had a very different personality than his predecessor. Where Trajan was a conqueror, Hadrian was a Where Trajan pushed boundaries, Hadrian built walls. Literally, wall. Imagine being so annoyed by your neighbors that you decide to build a barrier across an entire country just to avoid dealing with them. That's essentially what Hadrian did with Scotland. The wall stretched 73 miles across northern England, from coast to coast. It was built by Roman legions, who probably spent the entire construction period complaining about the weather, the food, and the fact that they were building a wall in what felt like the edge of the world just to keep out people who painted themselves blue and had strong opinions about Roman taxation. Hadrian was also responsible for rebuilding the Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon as we know it today, with its impossible concrete dome and that perfect circle of light falling through the oculus, was Hadrian's vision made manifest. It's one of the most architecturally sophisticated buildings ever constructed, and it was built with technology that we're still trying to fully understand today. The concrete alone is a mystery. Roman concrete has lasted 2,000 years and is still structurally sound. Modern concrete starts cracking after 50 years. We've sent people to the moon, but we can't figure out how Romans made concrete that could outlast civilizations. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, who managed to rule for 23 years without starting a single major war. In Roman terms, this was so unusual it was almost suspicious. His contemporaries called him pious, meaning dutiful or devout. because he spent his reign actually governing instead of conquering new territories or executing political enemies. Antoninus Pius was followed by Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the man who wrote Meditations while campaigning on the German frontier. He was a Stoic philosopher who happened to rule the world, and he spent his evenings writing notes to himself about duty, mortality, and the proper way to face adversity. Marcus Aurelius was everything a Roman emperor should be: thoughtful, disciplined, educated, and utterly exhausted by the burden of power. His personal writings reveal a man who would rather have spent his time in a library than on a battlefield, but who understood that duty required him to do whatever was necessary to protect the empire. Unfortunately, what was necessary included dealing with the Antonine Plague. The plague arrived around 165 Anno Domini, probably brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. It was most likely smallpox, though some historians argue it might have been measles. Either way, it was devastating. The plague swept across the empire for nearly 15 years, killing an estimated 5 million people. Entire cities were depopulated. Trade routes collapsed. The carefully maintained infrastructure that held the empire together began to strain under the weight of massive population loss. Marcus Aurelius spent the later years of his reign not writing philosophy, but desperately trying to hold his empire together as plague, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse threatened to tear it apart. He died in 180 Anno Domini, probably exhausted, definitely worried about the future. And he had good reason to be worried, because his son Commodus was about to become emperor. Commodus was the end of the 5 good emperors, and he was spectacularly, dramatically, almost artistically terrible at being emperor. Commodus believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, which was roughly equivalent to a modern president deciding to become a professional wrestler. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colania Comm. He commissioned hundreds of statues showing himself dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club. He was paranoid, violent, and completely detached from the practical realities of governing an empire. He left the actual work of administration to advisors and freedmen while he focused on his gladiatorial career and his elaborate fantasies about being a mythological hero. The Roman Senate, which had learned to be very patient with imperial eccentricity over the years, finally decided that Commodus had crossed too many lines. In 192 Anno Domini, he was assassinated by members of his own household, including his personal trainer and his mistress. His death marked the end of the Pax Romana, and the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Though that's a story for another time. But let's step back from imperial politics for a moment and talk about daily life in 2nd century Rome, because that's where some of the most fascinating stories hide. This was the century when Roman engineering reached its absolute peak. The empire was crisscrossed with roads so well built that many of them are still in use today. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water across impossible distances, using nothing but gravity and brilliant engineering to supply cities with more clean water per capita than many modern cities provide. Roman baths were social centers, entertainment complexes, and marvels of heating technology all rolled into one. The baths of Caracalla, completed early in the 3rd century but planned during the 2nd, could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. They included libraries, gardens, shops, and rooms heated by an underground system that circulated hot air through hollow walls. But daily life wasn't all marble and hot running water. Roman medicine in the 2nd century was a bizarre mixture of genuine insight and complete nonsense. Physicians understood anatomy better than anyone had before, thanks largely to a Greek doctor who became the personal physician to Marcus Aurelius. Galen performed public dissections, wrote detailed anatomical texts, and developed surgical techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for over 1,000 years. He understood that arteries carried blood, not air, which was a revolutionary concept at the time. He could perform cataract surgery and remove kidney stones. He also believed that all illness was caused by an imbalance of 4 bodily humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Treatment often involved bloodletting, purging, or consuming mixtures that included ground up precious stones, animal parts, and herbs that were sometimes more toxic than the original illness. Roman entertainment in the 2nd century had evolved into a sophisticated industry. Gladiators were celebrities with fan clubs, endorsement deals, and what we might recognize as trading cards. The most successful gladiators could earn enough money to buy their freedom and retire wealthy. But the most popular entertainment wasn't violent. It was chariot racing. The Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 spectators, making it the largest sports venue in human history. Chariot races were held almost daily, and the entire city would shut down to watch. Fans were organized into factions, identified by colors, and the rivalry between different factions could become so intense, it sometimes led to riots. Successful chariot drivers were the highest paid athletes in the world. One driver named Gaius Appuleius Diocles earned the equivalent of several $billion in modern money over his career. He was more famous than emperors, and probably considerably wealthier than most of them. Meanwhile, in the eastern part of the empire, Christianity was continuing its quiet revolution. By the 2nd century, Christian communities existed in every major city from Britain to Mesopotamia. They had developed their own literature, their own theology, and their own systems of organization. They cared for the poor, the sick, and the elderly, in ways that Roman society generally didn't. This made them simultaneously admired and suspect. Romans respected their charity, but worried about their loyalty. Christians refused to participate in emperor worship, which Romans saw as a basic civic duty. They met in secret, which made them seem conspiratorial. Periodic persecutions broke out, usually during times of crisis when emperors needed. Christians were blamed for natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems. They were executed in creative and horrible ways, often as public entertainment. But persecution didn't stop the spread of Christianity. If anything, it accelerated it. Martyrdom became a powerful form of witness, and the blood of martyrs really did become, as one early Christian writer put it, the seed of the church. The 2nd century was also when the Roman Empire reached its greatest cultural and intellectual achievement. This was the age of the Second Sophistic, when Greek rhetoric and philosophy experienced a revival that produced some of the most beautiful writing in ancient literature. Writers like Plutarch created biographical works that are still read today. Historians like Tacitus wrote with a psychological insight and literary sophistication that rivals modern authors. Satirists like Juvenal skewered Roman society with wit so sharp it could cut glass. Roman law was codified and systematized in ways that would influence legal systems for the next 2,000 years. The concept of innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, and the idea that laws should be written down and publicly available all come from Roman legal tradition. But underneath all this cultural achievement, economic problems were building that would eventually tear the empire apart. The cost of maintaining the army was enormous and growing. The empire's borders were under constant pressure from barbarian tribes, who were themselves being pushed westward by migrations and climate change. The plague had reduced the tax base and disrupted trade networks. After Commodus's assassination, the empire plunged into civil war. The year 193 Anno Domini became known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Different regions supported different claimants to the throne. The Praetorian Guard, which was supposed to protect the emperor, became a power broker that made and unmade emperors, based on who offered the highest bribes. Eventually, Septimius Severus emerged victorious, but the damage was done. The principle that had held the empire together since Augustus, The idea that imperial power could be transferred peacefully and legitimately had been shattered. The 2nd century ended with Rome still the greatest power in the world, still capable of magnificent achievements, still the center of a civilization that stretched from Scotland to Syria. But the Golden Age was over. The empire that had seemed invincible was discovering that it was mortal, after all. The roads that had carried Roman legions to victory were now carrying barbarian raiders toward Roman cities. The aqueducts that had supplied clean water to millions were becoming too expensive to maintain. The concrete that had seemed eternal was beginning to crack. Rome had spent 2 centuries believing that it could grow forever, that there would always be new lands to conquer, new peoples to tax, new sources of wealth to exploit. The 2nd century was when Romans began to realize that nothing lasts forever, not even the eternal city. But here's what's remarkable about this moment of recognition. Instead of giving up, Romans doubled down. They reformed their military, restructured their government, and reinvented their religion. The empire that emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century was different from the one that had conquered the Mediterranean. But it was still recognizably Roman, and it would survive for another 1,000 years. Because if there's one thing Romans were good at, it was adapting to survive. They might have been slowly poisoning themselves with lead wine additives, but they were also building concrete that would outlast their civilization. They might have been worshipping emperors who thought they were reincarnated heroes, but they were also creating legal systems that would influence human society for millennia. The 2nd century Anno Domini was when Rome learned that even the greatest empires are temporary. But it was also when Romans discovered that some things, the right things, can be eternal. The roads crumble, the aqueducts fall. The emperors become footnotes in history books. But the ideas survive. The laws endure. The stories keep getting told. And somewhere in the ruins of time, a Stoic philosopher-emperor is still writing notes to himself about duty and mortality, while steam-powered theater echoes through empty halls, and the ghosts of gladiators practice their moves in arenas that have become tourist attractions. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. Thanks for walking through another century of beautiful chaos with me. If you're still fascinated by the magnificent mess that was the Roman Empire, you know what to do. Share this with someone who thinks the modern world is complicated. And remember, we're all just trying to build something that will outlast us, preferably without accidentally poisoning ourselves in the process. Good night. Or as the Romans still never said, 200 out.